one of the reasons we need to encourage dialogue is look what happened this week with Wirecard and last week with Wirecard. Short sellers in general are basically in the same basket as Austrian school people. They don't get a lot of play on news networks. They're widely laughed at, and they are basically swimming against the stream at all time. You have to think about this. If you're a short seller, the system is set up essentially to make life as difficult as possible for you. I mean, you have a exchange that has been rigged to only go up, that is being rigged by the Federal Reserve, and companies that have disclosure requirements that continue to get looser and looser and looser, that now have access to more and more and more debt to try to lever up and to try to save themselves when they're not doing anything productive and they're not generating any cash. And if you're a short seller, you have to fight not only a garbage management team or perhaps a fraudulent company that has access to the capital markets that provide them with a perverse amount of liquidity that they don't deserve and the ability to go out and sell stock for as long as they want without, in Wirecard's case, even confirming their cash balances. Okay, the game is so stacked against short sellers, and then when you do finally think you're in the spot to put on the short, your risk is infinite and your potential upside is only 100%. So if you're a short seller, you are perpetually pushing this giant rock up a hill. But why do people do it? Do they do it because they just like getting punted in the balls? There's some kind of sick masochistic vibe to it, you know? Maybe some of the famous short sellers go home and they just walk on hot coals and ask their mistresses to smack them in the face repeatedly. Well, that could be a theory. I haven't talked to these guys about their personal lives. But more likely is the fact that they understand that the system, as fucked up as it is, still provides opportunities to go out and catch bold-faced frauds and make some money in the process, which is really one of the rewards for many short sellers, is you're pointing out gaping inefficiencies all the way to extraordinary frauds oftentimes, and you can make money doing it. So it is a ethical thing to do. You're helping rid the market of turds, which are just floating everywhere that you can see. So every once in a while, a short seller gets to flush one, and the rest of them remain floating. That'd be a good new Buffett analog, wouldn't it? If when the tide goes out, we see who's swimming naked. We have to come up with an analogy involving a toilet bowl and a bunch of turds floating around, and then one finally being flushed by short sellers. But the point is, if you can find yourself a turd to flush, you can be rewarded with it monetarily if you get ahead of it, and if you can convince the market that your research is second to none and is factual and accurate. And if you follow a lot of short sellers, what you'll notice about them, similar to what you would notice about Austrian economists, is that they're oftentimes exceptionally intelligent. They are not market novices. They have read every single thing that the company has put out. They've read every 10K. They've read every proxy statement. They've listened to every conference call. They've read every transcript. They know a lot of the businesses oftentimes better than the business owners know the businesses. Just like oftentimes a Austrian economist can sit down and tell you why the CPI numbers are fucked up, like Danielle did on the last podcast, or why the PCE numbers are fucked up. And those that are following the Keynesian flow and swimming downstream just cling to the CPI number as though that is the end-all, be-all, the number handed down from God himself and etched into the Ark of the Covenant, because that is the CPI, the almighty CPI. Like most of the macroeconomic data gets revised fucking 3 days later anyways. You know, short sellers often find that when they dig into these companies, under the surface, a lot of them are just dog shit. And so how can you go out and willingly get long a pile of crap and just hope that it continues to pump, like many stocks do? Thank you to the Fed that has continued to allow that. Or what do? Do you go out and you try to explain your reasoning to people and hope that the exchanges or the auditors or whoever follows suit and realize that you have in fact found a turd that is suitable for flushing. Now, I used the word there, reason, and there isn't much reason anymore in the stock market. It just isn't out there. And the more the Fed rigs the market, the less reason there is. Just like the gold chart in dollars that you can flip upside down. If you were to make a chart of Fed interventions in the market and that line was going from the bottom left corner to the upper right corner, and then you flipped that upside down on the x-axis, that would be a chart of how much reason there is. Because the more and more the game gets rigged, the weirder and weirder market psychology becomes, until you eventually just hit this point of fucking entropy where there really is no market psychology, because every single string that could be pulled is being pulled. And that, I think, is what's next. Not just with more QE, but with the Fed possibly buying stocks in the future. I mean, this is kind of what we're seeing in Japan, right? You just see the market trade sideways and you have stagflation for 20 years. And that's essentially a product of things not being able to be rigged any further than they're being rigged. But it's important to give short sellers a platform and a voice, because in the case of Wirecard, listen, I talked to somebody about Wirecard like 6 years ago. I remember just starting at my last job, which was probably 6.5 years ago. And I remember it had to be early on because it was before we had remodeled our office. And I remember taking a phone call with a friend of mine who's a well-known hedge fund manager who had mentioned Wirecard to me, but wasn't really involved in it and wasn't doing anything public with it, but said, hey, there's this German company and everybody kind of knows it's a fraud. He actually also, interestingly enough, he mentioned MiMedx to me like a year after that too. He was very, very early on both names. But he said, hey, listen, there's this German company and we all know it's a fraud, but they have the support of the government, they have the support of the regulators, and here we are 6 years later, and we find out that the cash isn't real. Okay? Now, if there was ever a reason to doubt the auditing process or the process that is undergone by public companies right now, and again, going back to what I said earlier, they really have it good, right? They're swimming downstream if you're a public company or you're a long. You have the wind at your back. Well, how do I know you have the wind at your back? Because if you can operate for a half fucking decade with a fake cash balance in the bank, somebody isn't doing their fucking job, okay? I know oftentimes I've said, well, an audit isn't what most people think that an audit is. I understand that because I've worked with short sellers and I've done research, and also I worked at a public company that underwent an audit. So I wasn't involved in it, but I watched how it took place on the daily. And, it was a bunch of young kids in their 20s, and I saw that the company, in most cases, the company winds up providing a lot of the information for an audit. An auditor isn't going through individual journal entries and accounting for every single candy bar that leaves the fucking vending machine in the break room. A lot of what an auditor does is provided to them by the company. And if you ever want to look for a red flag, by the way, in a company, you can see that the company, maybe their market cap or the size of the company doesn't really change, but their audit fees skyrocket. And then obviously if an auditor resigns or there's a lot of auditor changes, that's also a red flag. But if it costs a company $3 million in audit fees one year and nothing material changes, there's no giant merger, and then the next year the audit fees are $6 million, that's a red flag. And you can usually get the audit fees and all of the information related to the audit in a company's proxy statement, FYI. But how do you miss the fact that $2 billion in cash doesn't exist? This is a huge deal, and it is a huge failure, and it goes to show you why we need skeptics and people that can pull the curtain back in this industry. And funnily enough, I don't know if funnily is a word, but interestingly enough, and also funnily enough, Chanos tweeted out a couple of days ago that one of these German fucks, the COO or whatever, was a flight risk. They said Wirecard being looked at, being probed, and Chanos wrote, well, these guys are all flight risks. And here we are today. We find out, I think it was the COO just picked up from Germany and flew to the Philippines. Thank you very much. And then, of course, releases a statement like, well, this has nothing to do with the ongoing investigation, and I'm happy to provide any documents. This is what's fucked up. All right? The fake cash was in the bank for a half decade, and now this motherfucker's sitting on a beach in the Philippines trying to find the worm at the bottom of a tequila bottle, probably getting massaged by two workers out on the beach while he watches the waves crash, like Hans Gruber says in Die Hard. By then, we'll be sitting on the beach earning 4%. Almost as fucking annoying as that this morning was 3 seconds after I saw the news headline that Marcus Braun, who was the CEO, had been arrested, I saw a second headline that he was out on bail. Thank you very much. He posted $5 million in bail. Here's a fucking clue. If you arrest a guy for committing billions of dollars worth of fraud, maybe don't set his bail at $5 million, because I think he's going to have it. Just my 2 cents. You know, I'm just spitballing here, folks. But if you go out and you commit a fraud, and you fake that there's $2 billion in the bank, among other frauds that may have been committed at this company, I don't really know the details of it, and you pocket, let's say, $100 million as a result, or whatever this guy is worth, and then you get arrested, and then they set your bail at $5 million, now you're out of jail after you've been arrested, and you still got $95 million left. Something about that is not working properly. You can't go and then commit fraud to make yourself rich and then settle with the SEC for a portion of what you stole and bail yourself out with a portion of what you stole and just net leave the whole situation with cash. But many times that's often what happens, and it's just really another punt in the balls to short sellers, because after, you know, maybe you have taken the trade off and you're hoping for real justice in a lot of these cases, it almost never happens. I mean, Madoff was an exception. The guys from Enron were an exception. I don't know what's going to happen to Marcus Braun, but there have been an unnamed amount, a massive number of frauds that have been uncovered where the CEOs have just gotten a slap on the wrist. Shareholders almost always in those instances lose everything. The stock goes to zero, but the money that the insiders took while they were executives of the companies and the ways that they enriched themselves when they were participating in wrongdoing, well, they get to keep that. That's just another reason the whole system is fucked up, and we need guys like Jim Chanos on television. We need skeptics like Jim Grant. So we should be encouraging the media to talk to the people that have an alternate viewpoint on things and not just participating in a 24-hour-a-day confirmation bias fuckfest, which is essentially what is going on the daily.